Welcome to the Clean Library Podcast, where content meets conscience. We believe there are millions of you readers out there desperately searching for a better way to find clean content. Each episode, we will introduce you to a new author of clean books, giving you, your family, and your friends clean options.
Hello everyone, my name is Marcus Williams and I'm here with co-host Brock Morris, and today we have another exciting episode, a great interview. We're really excited to talk to Brianne Ritchie Córdova. She's been an avid reader her whole life and an avid daydreamer for most of it. What started as a quarantine hobby soon consumed every waking moment as she rekindled her childhood zest for writing, and she's since completed 11 novels across 4 different genres. She grew up in Southwest Michigan, but moved across the country to earn her bachelor's degree in neuroscience from Brigham Young University. Before her writing debut, she worked with kids on the autism spectrum using applied behavior analysis. She now lives in Utah with her husband and 2 daughters and enjoys binge reading, soccer, and critiquing cheesy films aloud to her captive audience of barely alive houseplants. Married to a sweetheart of her own, she's a sucker for romance. The swoony, make you giddy, healthy kind of love is her favorite. Welcome, Brianne. Thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. Before we jump into getting to know you, we need to read your 2 truths and a lie. So I'll read those now, so don't give them away. And throughout the interview, Brock especially might throw in some curveball questions that try to get you to reveal the secret, so don't fall for them. He's usually not very subtle, so it's not too hard to tell.
That helps.
Yeah. That's not my talent, subtlety. Yeah.
Me neither, so this will be great.
All right, perfect. All right, so number 1, I've gone to Comic-Con on accident. Number 2, my first published writing was a poem I wrote when I was 11. And number 3, I was on my university's ballroom dance team where I met my husband. So 1, accidental Comic-Con. 2, first published poem when you were 11. And 3, you ballroom danced at your university and met your husband there. All right, we'll see if we can try to figure those out as we go. Yeah, how do we work those into the questions? We'll find out. So you started writing during the pandemic and have already published a bunch of books. So, tell us about how all that came to be. Like, how did you decide when you're sitting at home with everyone else sitting at home that you were just going to write?
Well, okay. So first to clarify, I am not published yet.
Okay.
I've written 11 books.
Perfect.
That much is true. They're not published yet.
Okay.
That's the downside. I have 3 of them coming out next year with a small press called Conquest Publishing.
Okay.
They specialize in gritty stories and romance, but 2 of mine coming out are fluffy rom-coms. So they're open to lots of different romances.
All right, cool.
So that's exciting. So, sorry, just to set that.
Yeah, and we definitely want to dive into that because we've talked a lot about self-publishing versus traditional publishing, but kind of in between is that small publishing house that we haven't even explored yet. So this is going to be great to explore that option, that you don't have to go to Penguin Random House in order to get to be published that way. So when you started writing your books, was there an inspiration, or was it more out of just the boredom of being at home during the pandemic?
I think it was a little of both. There was a lot of, I'm second side, which I'm an introvert and a homebody. So I'm like, I don't actually mind this, but I should probably pick up a hobby, I guess. Because at the time I had 0 hobbies besides school. And that's not really a hobby because, textbooks, come on. And so a part of it was like the very first story I wrote had a lot of neuroscience inspiration in it, especially neuroplasticity, which is what inspired me to study neuroscience in the first place. It's the idea or the principle that your brain changes itself and it's constantly growing and learning, and every person's brain is completely unique. And so my first story kind of went off of that. I was like, well, what if she wasn't psychic? She just rewired her brain to mirror someone else's, So that's what it went off of. And it was a blend of 4 different genres with like a teaspoon of this and a handful of that.
Yeah, yeah.
Basically, it would be like impossible to market. So I'm not surprised that that my querying did not lead anywhere with that. And I'm, in hindsight, very grateful for that because I just kept writing and I got so much better
Yeah.
since then. So that's how it started out. It was a little bit of inspiration where I'm like, well, what do I know? What can I include in my books here? A lot of, I really love to read, and why not just write the stories I want to read? And also a little bit of boredom, just a little bit.
That works. I think all of us experienced a little bit of that at the time. Um, as you were writing, was it a conscious decision for you to keep your books clean, or was that something that a process, or how did that work for you?
It was definitely a conscious choice, especially where I've written from like thrillers and romantic suspense to romantic comedies and urban fantasy. So there's like quite a range there, and especially in the thrillers, like you mentioned before with your own books, it's hard when you have a villain who would definitely do things that are like gory or they would swear or anything like that. And so I'd have to find a workaround. Like, how do I show that they are just this bad to the bone, just like scum of the earth kind of person, right?
Yeah.
Without actually like going too dark or including content that I didn't really feel comfortable with my family reading.
Yeah.
And since they're my alpha and beta readers at first, before the rest of the beta readers come on, like I'm not gonna make them uncomfortable. I would be uncomfortable with them reading that too.
Right.
So that played a large part in it, and then a mixture of like personal beliefs and like accessibility for like the widest range of people without like going past what they're comfortable with as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think all of that came into play with my decision to write the way that I do.
And it's funny you mention your family, because that's not the first time we've heard that an author wants to write something that their mother can read without being embarrassed. I mean, that's a great standard, really.
Right. Or
I
my
mean,
grandma, that too.
yeah, exactly. I remember when I was a kid, there were times when, like, my grandma was a huge reader and retired, and so there were times when my parents, who didn't have the time, would ask my grandma to read a book first to see if it was okay for us to read. So it was my grandma who was kind of the content evaluator for us as kids when my parents didn't have the time to read. So I think that's important. It's funny that you're not the only one who said that, because I think that's actually true, that you want to, like, if your name's on it, you don't want to be embarrassed that someone else is reading it. I think,
Yes.
yeah. So when we talk about clean, there's, I mean, it could mean a lot of things. We've had people ask us that we've invited on the show, well, what does that mean? I don't know if my book applies, So for you, when you say your books are clean, how do you define that?
I'm so glad you asked. There's a lot of discussion about it, especially in the like the Bookstagram community, which is
Mm-hmm.
where I'm most active, and especially where like there's this misconception that clean, if your book is labeled clean, that means that if it has like on page sex, then that means sex is dirty. And there's already a lot of unlearning, especially in purity culture, related to that. And so I can see
Yeah.
why people want to gravitate away from that. But at the same time, clean is it's one syllable. It lays it out like no explicit language, no excessive gore, no on page sex, right? Like that's what it means to me, and like you convey all of that in one word, one syllable, nice and quick. Um, and that's why I love to use it too. And I see why a lot of other people use it, and when they
Mm-hmm.
do, that's what I read out of it. It's like there won't be much, if any, swearing, no gory scenes, no on page intimacy, all of
Yeah.
that. Um, yeah.
So is there a difference then between what would be clean for an 18-year-old and clean for an 8-year-old, or is clean separate from maybe age appropriate themes?
I think that's a great question. To me, I think a lot of that comes down to what genre it's marketed or what age group it's marketed to.
Okay.
So like clean middle grade would obviously include even less violence and gore and like no cussing at all. Versus like clean adult genre might have a little innuendo or like PG-13, like a few swears, but like maybe not the F bomb and stuff like that.
Right.
So it can definitely vary, and that's where marketing comes in. Like the cursed word for every author, marketing, right?
Yeah.
But like really developing your own brand as an author can help a lot with that. Like laying it out like, hey, this is what's in my books. If you're not comfortable with that, I want to make sure you're comfortable. So I'm just letting you know. And this is what you can expect.
So how do you, when you're choosing books that you're personally reading, how do you evaluate what's in the book before you choose them?
Ooh, that's so hard. I love it when they include blur like in the blurb, especially on Amazon, or like this is closed door or um, anything like that. Otherwise, it's a lot of trial and error where it's this sounds good, I'll try it, and then like 3 pages in, it's riddled with a bunch of content that I don't really feel comfortable like
Mm-hmm.
continuing with. And so I'm like, well, that was a bust. I guess I won't like read anymore from that author. So just kind of finding my auto buy authors. Like the moment they release something, I'm gonna buy it. I know I'm gonna like it. And
Right.
then a lot of reviews on Instagram. You just like finding the content creators who tell you like, hey, this is the spice rating. This is like swearing levels and stuff like that. It's hard to find them though.
Right.
That's the hard part there is finding those who will tell you and make it very clear like this is how I rate things. I let you know what you can expect. And then, you have to hope that the book that you're looking for has been reviewed by those people who do that. So
Right. And tell me if you find the same thing. I, it seems like a lot of people combine clean with religious. Like if it's clean, it must be a Christian book or some sort of religious book when those aren't necessarily the same thing. Like you can be, I don't know, they don't have to go together. I don't know. Does that
oh
make
yeah.
sense?
Yes, for sure. I think it is synonymous for a lot of people. Um, but again, like you said, it isn't necessarily true. There are lots of Christian books that have content that might not fall under a lot of people's definition of clean, and vice versa. A
Yeah.
lot of my characters aren't explicitly religious in the books. It just a lot of times it doesn't necessarily come up in the plot or whatever, and others are. So
Yeah.
it's clean kind of is an umbrella term that like Christian can fit under there, and so can a lot of other things. So I think a lot of other religions also look for clean content, and non-religious people do too. So
Yes.
Yeah, along those same lines, and I think you sort of alluded to this before. Uh, One of the things we've grappled with in having this clean sort of definition over content and books and things like that is that the intent isn't to vilify what we are considering not clean, or that there is a purity standard here, right? And if it doesn't meet this standard, then it's not worthy of being read, or it's not worth being talked about. It's almost that we're looking at this as sort of a different genre of content in general, right? If it's what you prefer, then you read it, and so, but that seems like a very hard thing to separate, and especially, Marcus, your question around religion, I think it gets melded together. Brianne, in the circles you run in, have you seen how that's handled? Is that how it's viewed? Have there been? Do you have any further insight on how you sort of separate it from this isn't a holier than thou sort of conversation, right? This isn't a we're better than you because we're saying that it's clean. It's just a chosen style of writing. But is there a way that's handled or discussed that you have any insight into?
what I've noticed the most is just interacting with people, even if I mostly interact with authors, right? And even if they write content that I don't, interacting with them and being like, "This is a great storyline. I really like respect and support what you're doing because writing is hard. Writing a book is hard. So few people actually finish a book, and even fewer get it published, whether self-publishing or trad or whatever route you go. And so just kind of like letting them get to know you. And social media is like the biggest, most easy way to do that. But a lot of people aren't active on social media. So as far as outside of that, I'm not sure I have an answer yet. I'm looking for one, but I don't have one yet.
Yeah, it's just that it's a tough line to sort of walk and try to to figure out. This isn't an intent to say that I'm separating myself from these other groups because we write clean content. It's just a preferred method, right? So,
right.
Well, and kind of like with TV shows and movies, you can choose the content you want to watch because there's a rating system in place so that you know what you're getting before you go in. I mean, of course, sometimes there are surprises, and you have to say, "Wait, how in the heck was that rated PG-13? That should have been R." But at least there's something. Whereas with books, it's kind of a free for all.
It really is. I remember growing up, I primarily read clean and or Christian romances, and so the first like contemporary romance that wasn't under that what is the word, classification, kind of just took me by surprise. I still remember like hiding the book under my bed. I'm like, I did not expect it to go like that. I was probably only like 14 too.
Yeah.
And I was, oh my gosh, I was so sheltered, and that really quickly like ripped me out from under my shelter. And I don't know, it was much different than how I would have preferred it to happen. And so it's very much a free for all.
Yeah, I kind of had the same experience with a political thriller, probably around the same age, when someone that I knew recommended it to me, and it was kind of same kind of reaction. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't. I didn't know what to do at that age. Like, how do you handle that? How do you process what you just read when you know that like, probably shouldn't be reading this? So this is not what I wanted, but he recommended it to me. You're right. And it's too late now, because once you've read it, it's done. Like, you've read it. It's in your brain. Yeah. So tell us about how did you go about submitting and getting your work accepted by this small publishing house?
Oh, of course. So I started querying my first book right after I finished in 2020. That didn't go very well, and I know why. And someday I'll go back and revisit it, probably, now that I'm a much better writer. But I kind of kept at it sporadically, querying the different books as I would finish them, because each one was better than the last, and I would switch genres and make different connections in the different publishing circles. And what finally was my big break with Conquest was an author friend that I made. We beta read for each other. And she actually went out of her way to reach out to me after she'd signed with them. She's like, hey, I found this small publisher. I just signed with them. I think your book would be a perfect fit. And so I took her up on that, and I submitted 2 different manuscripts, one an urban fantasy, one a romantic comedy. And just kind of hope for the best, because up until then it was just like a few requests for a full manuscript, but ultimately just rejection after rejection. So, and then a couple months later, I actually heard back from them that they wanted to continue with that. So we had a little Google Meets meeting. So I got to meet the publishing owner and talk through the different things that they offered as their publishing company, and the different perks and pros and cons, and how much creative freedom I would have with it, which is one of the things I was concerned about going trad versus indie,
Right.
And the nice thing about small presses, you don't have the reach and the fingers and all the pies that the big 5 have, but you do have more reach and a team behind you, and someone there to foster connections between the other authors at the publishing house, and someone rooting for you and still taking care of all the things that I'm just too overwhelmed to do myself. So
Right.
it was the perfect route for me for this stage in my life, for sure. And I'll always be grateful to that author for connecting us. And I try to do the same for my other author friends seeking the traditional route. Be like, you know what, this publisher's great. It looks like your manuscript's a match. Trying to like pay it forward, I guess.
Yeah, and it feels like with traditional publishing that a lot of authors, it's like just sending these manuscripts into a black hole, and it takes months to hear back, and you don't know who you're sending it to or who's reading it. So even in this industry, relationships matter.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. And it is definitely a long game too. Like one of the reasons I still continued with traditional publishing is because time was not really a problem for me.
Hmm.
I was like, well, I can wait. I'm already writing the next thing. So I was like, maybe that's an unusual perspective to take on it. Um, but it worked for me.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful that I was finally able to make that break after a few years and writing conferences and all sorts of writing tips on Pinterest.
So was there a time when you were ready to just give up and self-publish, or you were always, no, this is the route I want to go?
There were a few times I definitely thought about it, and if my girls were a little bit older, I think I would have gone that route for sure. Especially after really getting into the Bookstagram community
Hmm.
and like making author friends and reader friends and seeing like people are actually excited to read my books. What? And
It's a good
so
feeling.
and actually finding out like, oh, I could probably actually, do this and people would read it if I let them know that I published it. And then at the same time, looking into all that goes into self publishing, like I can't do that right now. At the
Right.
stage that I'm at, I have a 6 month old and a 2 year old. I have too many things on my plate at the moment. So that's just going to have to wait.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I don't want to imply to everyone listening that going self-published is giving up in any way on like
Right.
it's a it's a path that it's a choice, and one is you have to find what's best for you and where you're at. And
Mhm.
hey, for me with self-publishing for a lot of different reasons, and you it's traditional publishing, and I think it's important for authors to respect that decision of other authors. I see a lot of judgment, um, especially trad published authors judging self published authors that maybe their work's not good enough because they're self published, and I don't like why there shouldn't why not support each other.
Exactly. You still wrote a book, you still published. It's hard either way. And my
Right.
favorite authors are indie authors. I love their books so much. And some trad authors I love them too, and others I really don't. So there's a book out there for everyone. And
Yeah.
that self-publishing allows more books to get out there than what will sell well. Because that is a lot of times what it comes down to with traditional publishing. It's not whether or not your book is good, but whether or not there's a market for it. And there's always a market. It's just, is the market big enough?
Or are we willing to go out and find it?
Yes,
Or
exactly.
yeah. And that's the hard part. Either way you go is finding your people, your readers, your tribe, whatever you want to call it, the people who want the content you're creating. So do you think that writing clean books is an advantage or disadvantage in the marketplace, and why?
The marketplace at large, I would
Hmm.
say is a disadvantage because there's like the saying, sex sells, right?
Hmm.
And unfortunately, it is true for the general population. However, if you are able to find your community, it's tight knit. It's like there's so many great books there, and there is a market for it. It's just harder to find it, I guess, is my final answer on
Yeah.
that.
Oh, that makes sense. So one of my challenges is it feels like when I go on Book Talk or Bookstagram, it's mostly romance,
Yeah.
which doesn't it doesn't fit me. It doesn't like that's not where I'm comfortable. It doesn't fit my books. Do do you see other genres being represented there, or where should I go? I guess.
Great
Help.
question. It is definitely primarily romance, and I write romance in all of my
Yeah.
books but one. So, so I was like, it. it benefits me for the most part, but I have seen a few others trying to break out in TikTok and Instagram. It is definitely harder though. It's harder to find that corner of it where
Hmm.
romance isn't the main focus. I see a few. There's an author I follow who's querying an adventure. It's a thriller. It's a historical thriller,
Hmm.
and no romance at all. That's like one of her selling points. It's found family, but no romance. And so, um, they're there. It's
They're there.
I
Yeah.
don't I don't know. It's like searching hashtags maybe.
And I stitched a video on TikTok once where it was a female was saying, "Men, why don't you read interesting books?" And my response was, "What are you talking about? The books I read are interesting to me. They don't have to be interesting to you, but I read lots of books and they're interesting to me." So I don't know. I've found it challenging as a man without romance on social media, trying to, finding those people, and I'll keep plugging at it and trying and doing different things, but um, yeah, that marketing thing is tough. It really is.
Yeah, it is. Honestly, it's always tough, and it's especially tough if you aren't a romance writer. Because at least on those social media apps, that is the genre that dominates. It
Yeah,
is, unfortunately.
and it's funny when I put out books for ARC readers for reviews. The one that I get the most takes on is my Christmas book, which has some romance in
Oh man.
it. So, I mean, I'm like, okay, well, can I transition those readers into the other books?
Right. It's like, did you like the writing style instead?
Right,
Like, we can
right.
just work with that, you know?
So with
N-
your go ahead, Brock.
Okay. What I was going to say is now I've heard a few times the word querying, right? So as the resident neophyte to authoring and publishing, and maybe for any of our other readers out there, what does that actually mean? Can you, Brian, can you give us a little definition of when you say querying? What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked actually, because I had no idea about any of this when I wrote my first book. I had other author friends who were like, well, you're gonna have to do this. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? So querying is it's where you write a letter seeking publication, or if you're trying to get a literary agent to represent you, you're seeking representation and convincing them, basically, here's what my book is about. This is the target audience. Um, these are books that are similar and why, and will you please represent me or publish or read more about it? It's basically selling your book, but in one page.
Right.
Um,
This is
and
your first step into marketing, right? Or trying to market yourself at least
exactly.
to a literary agent or a publisher. Okay, that makes sense.
And how long does it take to get a response from those letters?
Usually months. Sometimes I've heard of other authors, they like get the rejection like immediately. Usually if it's just like not what the agent or publisher is looking for. Other times, and most often, it takes months to get a response. It is a
Uh,
long game.
Long
And are
game.
you not necessarily just going at one? I mean, is this sort of a shotgun approach where you're trying to query multiple?
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
got it. Okay.
So before you got referred to the publisher you're using now, how did you even find the ones you wanted to send it to? Obviously, there's the big five, but how did you find all the other ones?
Good question. I had an author friend direct me to, man, I'm like blanking on the name too. One of them, I think, is Query Manager or Query Tracker, where you can look up, it's a website, you can look up by genre what agents are representing that, and other times I just straight up Googled it.
Hmm.
Like publishers looking for urban fantasy that don't require agents. And I was able to find a publisher to submit to that ended up, they requested a full manuscript, which I did not ever expect because you end up in the slush pile if you don't have an agent like championing you, you know?
Right.
And oftentimes a slush pile is called a slush pile for a reason. It does not get much love.
Yeah. That's just got to be tough, waiting months and even forgetting you even submitted it to this person, and then you get a rejection letter. You're like, great, thanks.
Yes.
I was having a good day.
Exactly. I forgot I even did this, but now my day's kind of ruined.
Thanks a lot.
Exactly.
So if you could go back and give yourself advice when you started writing, what would you tell yourself?
A good question. I would probably tell myself not only to keep going, um, and that there are people out there who will read your books and they will love them. You just got to find them.
Mm-hmm.
But also thinking back to that very first book I wrote, pay attention to like genre expectations. It's like if you want it to hit a good note with the readers, have them really resonate with it, they're expecting certain things if they pick up suspense or thriller or rom-com, you know. They
Mm-hmm.
expect certain things, and there are certain beats you have to hit, like in the rom-com obviously they need to declare their undying love for each other, right? So that has to happen at some point.
Right.
And like the different relationship building scenes that lead up to it. And there's also word count to take into consideration. A lot of readers don't really care as much about it, but if you are going the traditional route, publishers and agents often care a lot about it, because again, genre expectations, and they're thinking about cost, right? Like the more
Mm-hmm.
pages there are, the more it costs to produce it. And if you're a debut author without this huge fan base behind you, how do they know it's going to sell? Like they could be spending all this money on this really thick book that no one's going to read.
Right.
And so that was something I wish I would have paid more attention to. I was like, well, it's a good enough story. It won't matter. Oh, well, actually, it's
That's
always room for improvement.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because I also feel, do you feel like that transit or that transfers to or includes certain genre tropes too? Because I think sometimes people use that word with sort of as like a dirty word, right? Like, you know, we're trying to get away from the genre trope. But when you say genre expectation, which I think is very legitimate, does that transition too? Do you feel like that there are some expectations that certain tropes, regardless of how cliche they might be, but that's included in that genre?
Yeah, I would say so
Yeah.
for sure. Like if it's a romance book and they go to the inn, there's gonna be only one room available.
Right.
It is what's gonna happen, right? And a lot of times, like it can be really cliche, and a lot of people dislike the cliche, and but a lot of people, like myself, live for it, right? Like, they
Yeah.
read the "Who did this to you" moment, right? Like,
Which kind of goes back to what you said earlier, which is write the books that you want to read, and it doesn't matter if it's cliche or it's meets a certain expectation. If it's what you like, chances are others are going to like it, right?
exactly. The comfort of knowing something or like having it be familiar to you, that's a lot of what drives especially romances, right? And so not to exclude you, Marcus, because you don't
No,
really write as
no.
many romances, but that's what drives a lot of it is the familiarity, right? Like that's the same
Yeah.
reason I go to a restaurant and order the exact same thing every time because I know
Right.
I love it, right? And I know what
Right.
to expect. So
Well, and that's why the Hallmark Channel is still in business, even though we
exactly.
we all joke that there's only, so many plots, but everyone loves it because they know
Exactly.
exactly what they're going to get. And yeah, and I mean, and I think that exists for other genres as well. Like I have a Western that I tried to follow certain tropes in that, the kind of the hero's journey of the rugged cowboy.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
yeah. And it's interesting though that you I don't know if it's school and English classes where you're taught to be creative and think outside the box, but really that's not what readers want. They don't want the out of the box book.
Or if it is out of the box, it has to be very calculated. Like these things
Right.
can be out of the box, but everything else has to fit very neatly in that box for us to allow that, you know? So
Right. Right. And I mean, if you try to think of what books have really broken through those barriers and have been popular, it's, I don't know, it's hard to think of off the top of my head. It's hard to think of those.
yeah, for sure. I don't think I have any. It's like even the classic literature that was pretty groundbreaking for the time, but now I'm not sure. Maybe I just don't read enough literary fiction, but
No, but I think it does play to a very niche fan base too, right? Like some of those that do break the mold so hard that yes, they get a lot of notoriety, but it becomes a very select group who really latches onto it.
yes, it's very
Otherwise,
polarizing. Either people love
exactly.
it or they hate it with a burning passion.
Uh, yeah, I guess there's pros and cons to that as well. You know, if you're getting attention and you're getting people talking about it, then that's marketing.
That's true. It's like
Other-
I think there's a saying like bad press is still press, or any kind of
uh,
press is still good. I don't
yeah,
know. There is a saying, and it's a good one, and I don't remember it.
no such thing as bad press or something like
Yes,
that.
There
there
you
you
go.
go.
There you go. There
That's
it
the
is.
one. You
I
got
put two
it.
together there.
Yeah, yeah. And frankly, that'd be awesome if people were talking about my books. I don't care if they like them or not. So, um, well, take one of your books and tell us more about the story.
All right. Well, I guess I should probably start with my debut that's coming out
Yeah,
next spring, about a year from now, which sounds like forever away, but at the same time, it's so close.
it'll
um,
come fast.
It's called Cream and Punishment. It is about an anxious baker who moves next door to the man whose life she ruined. And along that journey, she also catches a thief. So, her character was largely inspired by ADHD in
Hmm.
adult women and how it's so often misdiagnosed because it doesn't present the way that ADHD is stereotyped to present. Um, and so a lot of that drives her choices and the anxiety and the rejection sensitivity that she has, where she's like, oh my gosh, this guy hates me, I ruined his life, like why wouldn't he hate me, he's gonna like take his revenge any moment now. But the entire time, like, it's pretty obvious to the reader that the guy doesn't hate her like at all. And
Hmm.
so she's like making up these scenarios like, no, he's gonna take revenge, this is the worst, like I'm gonna die. And so it's an unusual dynamic in that sense, where she thinks they're like sworn enemies and she's just terrified of that retribution. And he's like the most golden retriever male lead ever, like just the happiest go luckiest person ever.
Yeah,
Which is exactly what her anxious self kind of needs at the end, you know. And the way that she like progresses and realizes why she thinks the way that she does is pretty huge in her arc. But
yeah.
it's
So
very
use
funny.
yeah using some of that neuroscience background.
Yes. I try to include some kind of heavier or more serious topic in all of my books, whether it's the fluffy hallmarky rom-coms or the thrillers where, you know, it's like action and
Yeah,
suspense the entire time. So
that's cool. That gives depth.
yeah,
And is
and
there
hopefully it raises awareness too, right?
Right, right.
do you find, and I love that also, where weaving in sort of these modern day, or I shouldn't say modern day, but some of these things that we're becoming aware of more now, real life challenges into a story. Is there a method to doing that in a way that still drives the story forward, whether it's mental health challenges or something like ADHD or whatever the case might be? What's sort of your approach to weaving that into a story, um, without it maybe overtaking the story, right? Without it being this isn't a book on mental health, right? But it is
Right.
part of real life.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to how you build your characters. I start with the characters and go with the plot from there. And so there'll come a lot of whatever it is, whether they have a gluten allergy, like another rom com lead, or anything like that. It just comes out in the way that they act and behave a lot of times. So it's not explicitly like preaching to you about mental health or anything, but it's like showing you like these people, this is the way they exist, this is the way they live, and there's a reason behind some of these choices. And as a reader, you get an insight into that. And that's what I love most about books is you get kind of in their head in a way that isn't overwhelming. I feel like if it was a mind reader, I would go insane like in a minute, right? But as a reader, it's more filtered. You get to picture it more like a movie that way. And that's how I like to filter it through is just how they act based on what it is about them. Kind of like how I may have anxiety and depression, but that doesn't like, that's not all I am, right? Like I'm not my mental illnesses or whatever. So that's the way I kind of look at it, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
Absolutely. No, it absolutely doesn't. Allows those who can relate to connect more to the character too, right? When it's written into their everyday life and those experiences are things that they likely then relate to, which was a beautiful thing to have in a story.
Yeah, that's the goal anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you have any clean authors that you would recommend to our listeners to look up?
So many. I'm so glad you asked.
Give us a couple.
I can like divide them up by genre too. So like urban fantasy, K.M. Shea, and Stormy Black, who writes in rom-com as well under the name Dulcie Dameron. Those are all what I would consider clean and great storytellers. And in romantic comedy, I'll try and keep it down to a few, but there are so many and I'm very passionate about it. So let's see. There's Gracie Ruth Mitchell. She also does some romantic suspense. Sarah Jane Woodley. Let's see. Now I'm blanking on all of them. All of them. After telling you I have so many. There's also Janessa Fayette, J.C. Howard, Rachel John, just to name a few. I could send you a whole list if you want. So.
Yeah, I think you've already listed more than most of our other guests. So
Oh,
that's great. That was perfect.
That's great for
indies, and I love their books so much. So.
Yeah. And that's great for our listeners to find books to read, but also authors that we'd like to have as guests maybe at some point on the show. So I think we've gotten to the point now where we need to go back to the Two Truths and a Lie and see if we can figure those out.
Yeah, and I've honestly been so enthralled with the conversation that I forgot to try to weave in a way to ferret out what is the lies. So
and here I thought you were just lying about not being subtle. I'm like, no, he's been doing this whole time and I didn't know this.
Yeah,
so do you want me to go?
I'm right, exactly. I'm just that good. Yeah.
Do you want me to go over them again, or?
Sure. Yeah, let's go over them.
Okay, so I've gone to Comic-Con on accident. My first published writing was a poem I wrote when I was 11. And 3, I was on my university's ballroom dance team where I met my husband. All right, Brock, what do you think?
So I'm just going to try to take from the information that we know. I think you said that you had picked up this hobby of writing during the pandemic, and it had been since you were 11 years old, I think was that what you said? Or maybe when you were young.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say you probably had written a poem when you were younger, when you were 11. So I'm going to say that's true. And ballroom dancing.
I'm supposed to tell you whether you're right.
No, you're just supposed to. Yeah, you're just supposed to stay. This
I got to make my
talking
guess
it out.
too.
I got to talk out my justification for my decision. And talk about meeting your husband, right? And that. I mean, I feel like you could be a ballroom dancer. So I don't know. I really have a justification. So I'm going to say going to a Comic-Con on accident. I mean, it's pretty, there's tight security there. You got to have a ticket. You have to, unless you snuck in and you don't seem like a sneaky person, but maybe you are. But I'm going to say that was going on accident is tough. So I'm going to say that's the lie.
All right. So I'm going to say, I know BYU's got a great ballroom dance team. And lots of marriages come out of that as they do the folk dancers, which was what I was on.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, and that was many years ago. So I'm gonna go, just to be different, I'll go with your first published writing was when you were 11, the poem. That's the lie.
So now I can tell you, right?
Yeah. Which one was the lie?
The lie was actually the ballroom dance team.
Oh, okay.
Our first date with me and my husband, it was salsa dancing, but it was at People Get
Gotcha.
Salsa Club. And I actually, the one ballroom class I was in, I really enjoyed it. I was also not technically enrolled, so I just showed up.
So you do sneak into things.
I like
Apparently, not on purpose. Like one time, like the ballroom dance class, it was because someone like signed up and they didn't realize it was for couples, and he didn't have a partner, so he was like, "Well, you mentioned you like to dance," and I was like, "Okay, sure." Pull my leg, why don't you?
There you go.
So how did you get into Comic-Con on accident? Which Comic-Con?
Good question. Yeah, again, I'm like painfully awkward and very socially anxious. So I was actually going for a concert, and it was an Alex Boyer concert that they were doing to benefit refugees. And so, like, all good things, right? And then they, like, the day and time got moved around, and they're like, we're going to do it at the Salt Palace after Comic-Con, like right after the day of Comic-Con ends or whatever. And I was like, all right, cool, I can handle that. Except I got the time wrong. And so I showed up a few hours early. And so I was just in there looking at everyone in their awesome cosplay. I'm like, wow, like I should have come to this. This is awesome. I wish I was here, for real. But they couldn't like kick us out yet. Like we weren't behind where the booths were and everything. So I'm not sure if I went to Comic-Con, but I was there, and there were cosplayers everywhere, and it was awesome, and I had some serious FOMO, but it was all an accident.
Love it. Count it. Absolutely.
Yeah, that counts. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you want to know more, we'll post more information in the description so that you can find Brianne's books when they come out next year. Please subscribe, follow the podcast, and we'll catch you next time on the Clean Library Podcast.